The crowd's roar hit Alec Wyatt like a physical thing, a wall of sound pressing against his ribs as he circled her on the frozen sand of the dueling yard, his borrowed spear trembling in hands that had never held one before this morning. Valda Thunderroar came at him with her twin war axes flashing silver under the pale winter sun, and for one terrible heartbeat he thought she meant to open his throat. Then her strike went wide, not by much. Not so anyone watching from the packed timber stands would have seen it as anything but a miss, a champion's rare stumble on the ice-slicked ground. But Alec had spent 3 years reading the mountain wind for the smallest shift that meant the difference between a safe crossing and a grave beneath the snow, and he read her now the same way. Her weight had shifted a half-breath too early. Her elbow had dropped when it should have snapped through. She had left him an opening as wide as a barn door, and she had left it on purpose. His spear point caught the leather strap at her shoulder, and by the ancient and absurd rules of the claiming duel, that was enough. Valda Thunderroar, undefeated champion of Kelmouth Hold, dropped to one knee in the blood-stained snow before 400 witnesses, and the whole dockside district went silent enough to hear the gulls crying over the fjord. Alec stood there with the spear shaking in his grip, staring down at her lowered head, at the dark braid falling over her shoulder, and he understood with a lurch in his chest that she had given this to him. She had knelt for him. And he had absolutely no idea what to do with a gift that large. It had not begun that morning. It had begun 8 months before, in a blizzard that should have killed him. Alec had been 3 days into the Cinder Pass with his mule train, 6 animals loaded with salt and dried peppers, and the last crates of feverbane root the coastal apothecaries could spare, when the storm came down off the Ashfang peaks like something with teeth. He had crossed that pass more times than any other trader fool enough to try it in the deep months, because Kelmouth paid well for salt when the fishing fleets could not put out, and because nobody else wanted the work badly enough to risk it. He was not brave, not really, not the way the garrison soldiers were brave. He was simply a man with no family waiting anywhere warm, and so the cold roads had become the only home he knew. That storm nearly finished him. 2 mules went over the switchback, screaming, and he lost feeling in 3 fingers before he stumbled through the hold's outer gate half frozen, babbling that there was fever sickness in the coastal towns, and he had brought the cure if anyone still wanted it. It was Valda Thunderroar who had hauled him bodily into the garrison hall by the collar of his coat, stripped the ice from his hands with her own, and shouted down 3 separate healers who wanted to send him away to the human district infirmary first. "He carries the cure to the sickness eating through my stores," she had snarled at them, in that voice like river stones grinding together. "And you want him to wait in a line." He remembered opening his frost-blurred eyes and finding her face inches from his, green-gray skin and amber eyes, and an expression of such fierce, uncompromising attention that he had thought, absurdly, through the pain and the cold, that he had never in his life been looked at so completely by another living soul. That had been the beginning, though neither of them had called it anything then. He kept bringing salt. She kept the garrison's ledgers and its granaries and its gunpowder-dry stores of pitch and rope, and somewhere in the trading and the arguing over fair prices and the slow accumulation of shared meals eaten standing up in the quartermaster's cold stone office, they had become something neither the orc customs nor the human ones had a tidy name for. Friends, at least. Something warmer than that, unspoken, dangerous to speak, on both sides of an old and bloody history that had taught humans and orcs alike to distrust each other's smiles. He had never once let himself imagine a duel, not until Threk Ironjaw made one necessary. Threk was the kind of orc warrior the old songs were built for, all corded muscle and scarred knuckles, second in the garrison hierarchy and hungry for the day he would be first. Alec had disliked him from their earliest meeting, the way Threk looked at the salt caravans like they were tribute rather than trade, the way he looked at Valda like she was a title waiting to be won rather than a woman who had earned every inch of her authority through 19 years of service. When Threk formally invoked the old claiming right before the garrison's assembled war council, demanding the chance to test the champion's seat, and by the ancient wording of the clause, to claim her hand should he win, Alec had been standing at the back of the hall delivering a manifest of dried cod, and he had felt something in his chest go cold and hard as river ice. "She will refuse him," Alec had said afterward, low, urgent, cornered with Valda in the narrow stone passage behind the granary stores where they often talked when the day's business was done. "Tell me she can refuse him." Valda's jaw had been tight enough to crack walnuts. "The claiming right is old law, Alec. Older than the Salt Accord, older than the treaty that lets your people trade on these docks at all. If a warrior of the garrison invokes it against a champion, she must answer or forfeit her seat entirely, and forfeiting it before a hostile challenger hands him the position without even the dignity of a fight." She had turned away from him, staring out through the arrow slit at the gray fjord below, her shoulders set in a line he had learned meant she was frightened and would rather die than admit it. "If I fight him honestly, I can beat him. I have beaten him twice already in the training yard, and both times he has gone away nursing his pride like a wound. But the claiming right lets him call for a formal duel with witnesses on his terms on ground of his choosing, and Threk does not fight fair when there are stakes worth cheating for. Then don't fight him at all. There is no other way unless—" She had stopped herself. Unless what? She had not answered him that night. He had not known, then, about the second clause buried deep in the old customs, that any person in the settlement, human or orc, garrison sworn or not, could lodge a counter-challenge ahead of a pending claiming duel, and that the challenges would be answered in the order they were formally lodged before the war council's scribe. He had not known that a fool with no formal army rank, no warrior's blood, and nothing to offer but stubbornness and a traitor's calloused hands could walk into that hall and put his name on the scroll before Threk's appointed day arrived. He found that out from Myra, the tavern keeper who ran the Salt Lantern down on the low wharf, the only person in Kelmouth's human district who had ever treated Alec like something more than a convenient supplier of pepper and preserved fish. "You look like a man who has swallowed a hot coal," Myra had said, setting a mug of spiced cider in front of him 3 nights before the appointed duel, her graying hair escaping its knot as it always did by evening. "Spit it out or choke on it, Wyatt. I have no patience for brooding customers." He had told her everything, the whole tangled shape of it, and she had gone very quiet and then very still, the way people did when they were about to say something he would not want to hear. "There's an old clause," she said finally. "My grandmother traded up at the hold before the last border war closed the pass for a decade. She used to talk about the orc customs like they were riddles wrapped in knives. Any challenge lodged before the appointed day stands first in line. If you win it, the matter's settled and the second challenger's claim dies with it." She had looked at him hard, weighing something. "You'd be mad to try it. She could kill you without trying, Alec. Truly kill you, not bruise your pride. I know. And you'd do it anyway." He had turned his cup in his hands, watching the steam curl up into the smoky rafters of the Salt Lantern, and found that his answer came without hesitation, which surprised him more than the question had. "I've spent 3 years crossing a mountain that's killed better men than me for less reason than this. I'm not going to let Threk Ironjaw take her, because I was too much of a coward to stand in the yard for an hour." Myra had reached across the bar and gripped his wrist, hard, the way a mother might. "Then you go to the scribe tonight before you lose your nerve. And Alec, you tell her yourself. Don't let her hear it from the garrison gossips. Whatever this is between the two of you, she deserves to hear it from your own mouth." He had gone to Valda's quarters that same night, past the sleeping granary stores and the frost-rimed courtyard where the garrison kept its watch fires burning low, and found her awake. Of course she was awake, sharpening a blade she did not need to sharpen because her hands needed something to do that was not pacing. "I lodged a counter-challenge," he said, before he could talk himself out of it. "Before Threk's date. I stand first in the order now." The whetstone stopped moving in her hand. "You did what?" "You heard me." She had risen from her stool so fast the bench clattered backward, crossing the small stone room in 2 strides to grip the front of his coat, and for one wild moment he thought she meant to shake him or strike him, and instead she simply held on, her amber eyes searching his face like she was trying to find the lie in it and could not. "You do not know what you have done," she said, low and furious and frightened all at once, a combination he had never heard in her voice before. "You think this is a trader's bargain, a matter of scales and coin you can walk away from if the term's sour. This is blood law, Alec. If you fight me and lose, the crowd will call you nothing worse than a fool who overreached, and you will limp home with your pride bruised. But if you fight me and somehow, impossibly, win, then I claim you," he said quietly. "I know what the words mean, Valda. I read the scroll before I signed it. I'm not a fool, whatever the town thinks of me. They will never accept it. My people will say I let a weak thing best me out of pity, and yours will say I bewitched you, or bought you, or broke you to my will, and neither will ever believe a human man beat an orc champion clean, because neither side has ever believed we could stand as equals at all." Her grip on his coat had not loosened. If anything, it had tight, drawing him half a step closer, close enough that he could feel the heat of her breath, see the fine scar through her left eyebrow that she'd once told him came from a training accident at 14. "Withdraw the challenge. Tell the scribe you spoke in anger. I will find another way to answer Threk, I swear it to you, but do not do this." "I won't withdraw it." His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Not because I think I can beat you, Valda. Gods, I know I probably can't. You could put me on my back in 4 seconds if you wanted to, and we both know it. But I would rather stand in that yard and lose honestly than stand at the fence and watch Threk Ironjaw drag you off like a prize he won at a fair, when everyone in this fortress knows he cheats when the stakes are high enough. I'd rather fail trying to protect what matters to me than succeed at doing nothing." He reached up slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and laid his frost-scarred hand over hers where it still gripped his coat. "You told me once that the hardest crossings are the ones worth making. You were talking about the pass. I don't think you were only talking about the pass." Something in her face had cracked open then, some careful, guarded thing she kept locked as tightly as the hold's own granary doors, and for a moment he saw not the fearsome champion the whole fortress spoke of in hushed and admiring tones, but a woman who had spent 19 years being strong for everyone else and had never once let herself imagine someone might choose to be strong for her. "If you die in that yard," she said, and her voice had gone rough, nearly breaking, "I will never forgive you for it." "Then I suppose I'd better not die," he said, and something that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, escaped her, and she had kissed him hard, sudden, her hand fisting in his collar to drag him down to her height, tasting of wood smoke and the bitter tea she drank against the cold, and he had kissed her back with all 3 years of loneliness finally breaking loose at once, his hands framing her jaw like she was something precious he was terrified of dropping. It had not lasted long. She had pulled back first, breathing hard, resting her forehead against his for one long moment. "You are the most reckless man I have ever met," she whispered, "and I have met warriors who charged cannon fire for a dare. I've been told. If you insist on doing this fool thing," she said, straightening, some of the old iron creeping back into her spine, "then you will let me teach you how not to die in the first 4 seconds at the very least." He had trained with her in the empty granary yard every night for the 3 days remaining, learning to hold a spear properly, to read the shift of an opponent's weight, to fall without breaking his neck when she inevitably put him on his back, which she did, over and over, patient and exacting and never once cruel about it, correcting his footing with hands that could crush stone, but touched him like he was made of something finer. On the second night she had shown him the trick of watching an opponent's hips instead of their eyes, because the eyes could lie and the hips could not, and he had used that very lesson, 3 days later, to read the lie in her own stance when she chose, in front of the whole watching town, to let him win. He understood it now, kneeling in the frozen sand beside her, his hand hovering uncertainly over her bowed shoulder. She had not lost because he had outfought her. She had lost because somewhere in that circling, clashing hour, she had decided deliberately, with her eyes wide open, that she would rather be claimed by an honest man who had told her the truth when silence would have been safer, than remain unclaimed and available to a warrior who would use her position to bleed the fortress dry. "Champion Thunderroar," rang out the voice of the War Council's scribe, an old orc named Gruv with a ceremonial staff and a face like a disapproving cliff face, yields the claiming duel to the challenger Alec Wyatt, trader of the Low Wharf. By the old law, the claim stands. He did not sound pleased about it. Nobody in the stand sounded pleased about it. There was a long, ringing silence, and then it broke apart into a roar of noise so mixed with outrage and disbelief, and scattered, startled laughter that Alec could not tell one voice from another. He helped her to her feet instead of waiting for the ritual to demand it, and her hand closed around his forearm hard enough to bruise, though whether from anger, fear, or something else entirely, he could not have said. Across the yard, Threk Ironjaw stood rigid with fury, his knuckles white around the haft of his own weapon, and even from that distance Alec could feel the weight of his stare like a blade pressed to the back of his neck. "This is not finished," Threk called out, his voice carrying easily over the crowd noise. "A human cannot claim a champion of the garrison. The law was never written with worms like him in mind." "The law," said old Gruv, in a voice that brooked no argument even from a warrior twice his size, "says any who lodge challenge in proper order and proper form may stand for it, Threk Ironjaw, and does not trouble itself with the shape of their blood. You know this as well as I." But the seed was planted, and Alex saw it take root in the crowds, murmuring almost instantly that this was wrong, unnatural, a trick, a mockery of custom, that a man who looked like nothing more than a half-frozen salt trader could not possibly have bested Kelmouth's champion by honest strength, and that something crooked must explain it. He saw the same thought moving through the human side of the crowd too, wearing a different face. That Valda Thunderroar must have thrown the fight to trap a human man into some monstrous orc bargain. That Alec Wyatt was a fool who had wandered into a beast's snare, and would regret it before the week was out. Neither side, he realized with a sinking heart, believed that two people so different could simply choose each other freely. Neither side could look at what had happened in that yard and see it for the truth it actually was. Valda must have felt the same current moving through the crowd, because her grip on his arm tightened, and she turned to face the stands with her chin lifted and her shoulders squared, every inch the champion again despite the blood on her lip and the snow melting into her braid. "The claim stands," she said, loud enough to carry, "because I yielded it, and I yielded it with clear eyes and clear mind, and any who says otherwise may take the matter up with my axes instead of my scribe." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd at that, and some of the tension bled out of the air, though Threk's stare did not waver, and Alec understood that this was not over. This was only the opening move. They found a private moment that evening in the hidden courtyard behind the customs house, a small forgotten space between two warehouse walls where the dockworkers sometimes napped in summer, and nobody thought to look in winter. Valda had led him there without a word, and the moment they were out of sight of any watching eyes, she pressed him back against the cold stone and kissed him again, fierce and hungry and shaking faintly, her hands fisting in the front of his coat. "You terrified me," she said against his mouth. "You absolute reckless fool of a man. I noticed you didn't actually try very hard to kill me." "I tried very hard not to," she corrected, and there was a rawness in her voice that undid something in his chest. "Do you understand what you asked of me, Alec? To lose, in front of everyone, in front of my own garrison, in front of a warrior who will use it against me for the rest of my days. Orc champions do not lose duels. We do not yield. It is not in us." Her forehead dropped to his shoulder, her breath coming hard and uneven, and he wrapped his arms around her because it was the only thing he could think to do, holding the fiercest woman he had ever known while she trembled in the aftermath of a choice that had cost her more than he had understood in the moment he made her make it. But I looked at Threck standing there so certain of his victory, so certain I would simply hand him whatever he wanted because the law demanded it. And then I looked at you standing across that yard with a spear you barely knew how to hold, shaking, terrified, and staying anyway. And I thought, I would rather kneel to this fool than stand beside that monster for one single day. I chose it, Alec. Do not ever think you took anything from me that I did not give freely. He kissed her hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and cold iron that always clung to her. I love you, he said, the words falling out of him with none of the careful weighing he had intended to give them. 3 years of loneliness and 8 months of slow-building devotion collapsing into 3 simple syllables in a hidden courtyard smelling of brine and tar. I should probably have said that before I put my name on a challenge scroll, but there it is. Valda went very still against him. Then she laughed a real laugh, warm and startled and a little wet, muffled against his collarbone. You absolute backward fool. You tell a woman you love her after you have already won her. She lifted her head, and her amber eyes were bright in the gray winter light. I have wanted you since the blizzard, Alec Wyatt, since you looked at me half frozen and near death and still tried to argue with me about the price of feverbane root. I told myself it was foolishness, that a human and an orc could never build anything that would not be torn down by every fist in this fortress. And then you stood in that yard for me anyway. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, over his hammering heart. I love you too. I have for longer than I let myself admit. They stayed in that hidden courtyard until the cold finally drove them back toward the warmth of the garrison hall, hands linked. And for one brief evening it felt as though the hardest part might already be behind them. It was not. 3 days later, Threck Ironjaw stood before the joint council of Kelmouth, hold the war council of orc elders, and the human town magistrates who together governed the fragile peace of the Salt Accord, and formally accused Valda Thunderroar of oath-breaking, of throwing a sacred duel in defiance of the old law, and demanded the claim be voided, and the champion's seat stripped from her entirely. The council chamber was a long stone hall built into the fortress's oldest wing, its high windows letting in thin winter light that did nothing to warm the tension gathered beneath its rafters. Magistrate Corwin Hale, a narrow gray-bearded man who represented the human district's interests, sat at one end of the long table beside Guildmaster Dissin Farrow, a merchant whose fine furs and soft hands had never once touched a mule's lead rope, and whose eyes kept sliding toward Threck with an expression Alec did not trust at all. At the other end sat 3 orc elders, weathered and silent, flanking old Gruv, who held the scroll of law across his knees like a shield. I have witnesses, Threck announced, his voice ringing off the stone, who will attest the champion's footwork faltered in a manner inconsistent with honest combat. I have trained beside her for 11 years. I know the shape of her true strength, and what I saw in that yard was not it. Convenient, Valda said, standing at the center of the chamber with her arms crossed, that you noticed this falseness only after losing your chance to claim my seat through it. Silence, Magistrate Hale said mildly, though his eyes had already settled on Alec with open suspicion. Will be observed until called for, Champion Thunderroar. Alec stood beside her, feeling every inch the outsider he was in a chamber built for orc law and human politics both, and yet he found he was not afraid, not of the council, not of Threck's glowering fury, not even of the very real possibility that this could end with Valda stripped of everything she had spent 19 years building. He was afraid only of staying silent when speaking might matter. If it please the council, he said, and his voice did not shake nearly as much as he expected it to, I would ask why a garrison captain who lost cleanly according to the scribe's own record is suddenly so certain the loss was false, and I would ask what he stands to gain from convincing this council to believe him. Threck's lip curled. The traitor speaks. How novel that a man who has never held a proper weapon before 3 days ago presumes to lecture this council on the nature of combat. I don't need to be a warrior to add figures, Alex said. I've been running salt and grain manifests through this fortress for 3 years, Captain Ironjaw, and I know exactly how much this hold consumes in a hard winter, because I'm the one who sells you half of it. He turned to face the council fully now, reaching into his coat for the leather ledger he had carried with him, the one thing he had thought, 3 sleepless nights ago, to bring. 3 weeks passed. I delivered 40 sacks of preserved grain and 12 barrels of salt fish to the garrison stores, signed for and witnessed by the quartermaster's own aide. I checked the granary stores myself 2 nights ago, because Champion Thunderroar asked me to help her reconcile a discrepancy she'd found and could not explain. 16 of those sacks are missing. 4 of the barrels are gone entirely. There is no record of their use in feeding the garrison, no record of spoilage, no record of anything at all except a private ledger kept separately from the official store's account, in a warehouse down on the low wharf that Captain Ironjaw has visited 11 times in the last month, always alone, always after dark. A murmur went through the chamber. Threk's face had gone very still. "This is nonsense," Threk said, too quickly. A trader's tricks with numbers, meant to muddy honest accusation. "I have the second ledger," Alex said quietly, and set it on the long table with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the whole chamber. "I found it 3 nights ago, hidden behind a false wall in the warehouse you lease under a false name, Captain. I would not have thought to look, except Champion Thunderroar mentioned once that the granary numbers had never once failed to balance in 19 years of her keeping them, and that something had begun failing to balance only in the last 2 months, since roughly the time you began pressing your claiming right. I began to wonder what a man might want with a fortress's supply authority badly enough to force a duel over it, and whether feeding a raider force waiting beyond the pass might be worth more coin than any honest wage a garrison captain could earn." The chamber erupted. Guildmaster Pharaoh's soft hands had gone white-knuckled on the table's edge, and Alec watched, with a cold clarity he had not expected of himself, the exact moment the merchant realized his own name might appear somewhere in that second ledger's careful, damning columns. "The Scarn Reavers have been probing the coastal approaches for a month," Valda said into the roaring silence, her voice like a blade drawn slow from its sheath. "I reported the sightings to this council myself. If our granary stores have been quietly bled dry, while a raider force gathers beyond the pass waiting for the deepest cold to strike, then whoever engineered that theft has been arming Kelmouth's enemies with the very supplies meant to help us survive a siege, and has been doing it, I would guess, in exchange for a healthy cut of whatever the Reavers plan to loot once the walls fall." She turned to face Threk directly, and something terrible and satisfied moved behind her amber eyes. "You did not want my seat because you wanted to marry me, Threk Ironjaw. You wanted it because a champion who trusted you would never think to check the granary numbers herself, and a champion who did not trust you would keep checking them until she found exactly what my trader found 3 nights ago." Old Gruv rose slowly to his feet, the scroll of law trembling faintly in his weathered hands, and when he spoke his voice carried a fury that made the whole chamber fall utterly silent. "Bring the second ledger to the elder's table," he said, "and bring the warehouse keys found upon Captain Ironjaw's person if the trader thought to secure them." Alec had thought to secure them. What followed was not quick, and not clean, but by the time the short winter afternoon had burned down into evening, the joint council of Kelmouth Hold had reversed itself entirely. Threk Ironjaw stood accused not of losing an honest duel, but of treason against the fortress that had trusted him, of diverting siege stores for coin from a raiding force that meant to burn the docks and slaughter half the town, and Guildmaster Dissin Pharaoh, whose name did indeed appear in that second ledger's careful columns, was placed under guard before he could so much as reach for the door. "The claiming duel stands," Magistrate Hale announced, his gray face grim but resolute, not merely as legitimate but as an act of considerable wisdom on the champion's part, whether she knew the full shape of the danger or not. She chose to place her trust in a man of proven honesty over a warrior of proven greed, and this council owes her an apology rather than a trial. He looked, for the first time, almost embarrassed. Champion Thunderroar, Traitor Wyatt. This council recognizes the claim and offers what amends it can for having doubted it. The crowd that had gathered outside the chamber doors, drawn by rumor and restless waiting, did not cheer. Exactly, the shock of it was too fresh, too strange. Humans and orcs alike still working through 19 years of prejudice in the space of a single afternoon. But Alex saw something shift in the faces pressed against the courtyard gates as Valda emerged beside him, her chin high, her hand finding his without hesitation in front of everyone. He saw an old orc woman near the front lower her suspicious scowl by a fraction. He saw a human dockworker who had jeered at him 3 days ago, now simply watching, silent, reconsidering. It was not acceptance, not yet, not fully. But it was a crack in something that had been solid stone for a very long time, and Alec understood that cracks were how the light eventually got in. They did not have time to savor it. The alarm bell began ringing before the council chamber's doors had even finished swinging shut. A deep, frantic clanging from the watchtower above the fjord that every soul in Kelmouth had been dreading since the first hard frost. Threk Ironjaw's treason had bought the Skarn Reavers exactly what they needed: a fortress with weakened granaries, a garrison distracted by scandal, and a winter storm rolling down off the Ashfang peaks thick enough to hide 100 longboats until they were already in the fjord's black water. "They're early," Valda said, already moving, already shedding the careful composure of the council chamber for the hard focus of a woman who had spent 19 years preparing for exactly this night. They were meant to wait for the deep freeze. Someone must have warned them the theft was discovered. Her eyes found Alex, fierce and urgent. "I need every hand the quartermaster's stores can spare, and I need you more than any of them, because you know the pass roads better than any soul in this fortress, and I need those roads blocked or guarded within the hour. Tell me where to start." What followed was the longest night Kelmouth Hold had seen in a generation, and Alec would remember it afterward not as one single terror, but as a string of small, desperate victories strung together by Valda Thunderroar's relentless, unshakable competence. She had the garrison's remaining grain moved by torchlight into the deep cellar beneath the customs house, out of reach of any fire the Reavers might set to the warehouses. She had the dockworkers rig the old harbor chain across the fjord's narrow mouth, a rusted defense nobody had bothered to test in a decade, and when it groaned but held against the first longboat's hull, a ragged cheer went up from the wall that Alec felt in his own chest like a physical thing. She had barrels of the very salt fish Alec had spent 3 years hauling through the pass broken open and soaked with lamp oil, then rolled down onto the ice-slicked dock, stairs the Reavers would have to climb to reach the warehouse district, so that when the raiders finally came scrambling up out of the dark with axes raised, they found the ground itself turned to a treacherous, burning hazard beneath their boots. "Where did you learn to think like this?" Alec had shouted at her over the chaos, as they worked side by side hauling the last of the oil-soaked barrels into place. 19 years of keeping a fortress fed on half enough coin and a quarter enough time, she shouted back, grim and almost laughing despite everything. "A quartermaster who cannot improvise starves her own people in a good year, let alone a siege." The Reavers hit the dockside district in the deepest part of the night, a ragged, howling mass of raiders in mismatched armor pouring off their longboats onto the burning stairs. And the fighting that followed was close and brutal and terrifying in a way Alec had never known before, all torchlight and screaming and the wet clang of steel. He was no warrior, and he knew it, and he spent most of that fighting doing exactly what he was best at: running messages between the garrison lines and the granary stores, guiding frightened dockworkers and their families through the warehouse district's back alleys toward the fortress's inner gate, using 3 years of knowledge about which crates were sturdy enough to hide behind and which warehouse doors led to dead ends. It was on one of those runs, ducking through the narrow gap between two salt warehouses with an old woman and her two grandchildren in tow, that a knot of reavers cut off his retreat. There were 4 of them, wild-eyed and blood-spattered, and Alec had nothing in his hands but an empty grain sack and a lantern. And for one endless, freezing moment, he understood with total clarity that he was about to die in an alley smelling of brine and smoke, having finally found something in his life worth losing. Then Valda Thunderroar came around the warehouse corner like something out of the old war songs, both axes already swinging, and the world dissolved into noise. He would remember it afterward only in fragments, the old woman screaming as she pulled her grandchildren back against the wall, the wet crunch of Valda's axe meeting a raider's shield, the way she moved through the narrow alley like the space had been built for exactly her size and no other, brutal and precise, and utterly without hesitation. One raider went down. A second turned to flee and did not make it 3 steps. The third came at her from the side while her axes were still buried in the first man's fallen shield. And Alec, without thinking, without any plan beyond the pure animal need to matter in that moment, swung the heavy iron lantern in his hand into the side of the man's skull with every ounce of strength 3 years of hauling mule packs had given him. The raider dropped. The fourth took one look at the champion of Kelmouth, standing over 3 fallen comrades with murder in her amber eyes, and fled back toward the burning stairs. For a moment, neither of them moved. Valda stood breathing hard in the flickering torchlight, blood that was not her own spattered across her jaw, and Alec stood with the dented lantern still clutched in his shaking hands. And then she crossed the alley in 2 strides and hauled him against her so hard the breath went out of him, one hand fisted in his hair, the other arm locked around his back like she meant to fuse them together through sheer will. "You absolute, reckless fool," she said into his hair, her voice cracking. "I told the sergeant to keep you at the granary. I told him to keep you safe. There were children in that alley, Valda. I wasn't going to leave them. I know," her arms tightened. "I know, and that is exactly why I love you, and exactly why my heart nearly stopped when I came around that corner and saw you standing between 4 reavers with nothing in your hands but a lantern." She pulled back just far enough to look at him, cupping his face in both blood-slicked hands, searching him for wounds with a desperation that made his chest ache. "Are you hurt? Tell me the truth." "I'm not hurt. Valda, I'm not hurt. Look at me, I'm fine." She kissed him then, hard and fierce and shaking, right there in the alley with the old woman and her grandchildren still huddled against the wall, and the sounds of fighting still ringing from the docks below, and it tasted of smoke and salt and terror and relief all tangled together. And when she finally broke away, her forehead stayed pressed to his, both of them breathing hard, neither willing to let go. "Stay behind me for the rest of this night," she said, low and rough. "I mean it, Alec. I cannot fight the reavers and lose you in the same hour. I cannot do both." "Then let me fight beside you instead of behind you," he said. "I can't swing an axe like you can. But I can watch your back the way I've watched the mountain for 3 years, and I would rather do that than hide." She looked at him for a long moment, something fierce and tender and entirely unguarded moving across her face, and then she nodded once, sharp and final, and took his hand. They fought the rest of that night together, not as equals in strength, for nothing would ever make him her equal with an axe, but as something else, something the old customs had never quite found a word for. A warrior and the man who watched the ground she could not watch, who knew which alleys led to traps and which crates would hold a man's weight, and which warehouse held enough lamp oil to turn a raider's charge into a wall of flame. Twice more that night his knowledge of the docks turned the tide of a skirmish. Once his warning shout about a collapsing pier saved 3 garrison soldiers from being swept into the freezing fjord water. By the time the eastern sky began to gray with the first hint of dawn, the Scarn reavers who remained were fleeing back to whatever longboats had survived the burning stairs and the harbor chain, leaving their dead scattered across the dockside snow, and their ambitions broken against a fortress that had, in the end, refused to be caught unprepared. Kelmouth hold had held. The dawn that broke over the fjord was the strange, hollow kind that comes after any long night of fear, pale gold light spilling across smoke-stained snow. Gulls already circling back to investigate the wreckage. The harbor chain still groaning faintly in the current where it had done its work and would need mending. The dockside district was a ruin of burned warehouses and shattered crates and one collapsed pier, and yet the granary stores stood untouched in their deep cellar, and the fortress walls stood unbreached, and the death toll, when the garrison finally counted it in the gray morning light, was mercifully, miraculously small. Alex sat on an overturned barrel near the customs house courtyard, exhaustion sitting on him like a physical weight, watching Valda move among the wounded with the same relentless competence she had shown all night, directing healers, checking supply counts, comforting a weeping dockworker who had lost his warehouse but not his family. She looked as tired as he felt. Blood and soot streaked across her face, her braid half undone, and he thought, watching her, that he had never in his life seen anything so magnificent. It was old Gruv who found them both an hour later, as the last of the wounded were carried up toward the garrison infirmary, and told them what the council had decided in a hastily convened dawn session. Threk Ironjaw and Guildmaster Pharaoh would stand trial for treason once the fortress had time to breathe again, and the joint council wished it known, publicly and without qualification, that champion Valda Thunderroar and traitor Alec Wyatt had between them saved Kelmouth hold twice over in the space of 5 days, once from a traitor's corruption, and once from a raider's axe. The council also wishes to know, Gruv added, with something almost like a dry smile creasing his weathered face, whether the champion intends to keep her claimed mate, or whether some further ceremony is required to make the matter proper in the eyes of both our peoples. Valda looked at Alec for a long moment, and something in her exhausted face softened into an expression he had only ever seen her wear when she thought no one was watching. "There is a way," she said slowly, "among my mother's people that is not written in the War Council's dueling law because it was never meant for lawyers or scribes. It is older than the claiming right. It is called the Winter Hearth." She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers, heedless of the soot and blood still drying on both of them. On the longest, hardest night of winter, two who mean to bind their lives together light a single flame and tend it through the dark, feeding it, guarding it, refusing to let it die, no matter what the night throws against them. It is said the flame that survives until dawn carries the truth of the bond within it. My people do not marry with rings or scrolls, Alec. We marry with fire that neither of us lets go out. Tonight is the longest night, Alec said quietly, understanding. The solstice. It was meant to be. The Reavers chose it on purpose, thinking a fortress distracted by its own customs would be easier prey. Her thumb traced slow, absent circles over his knuckles. The council delayed the hearth lighting when the alarm bell rang. But the night is not yet over. If you are willing, I've been willing since I signed my name on that challenge scroll, he said. Probably longer than that, if I'm honest. Since a blizzard and a woman who shouted down 3 healers to save my hands. She laughed then, a real laugh, exhausted and radiant, and kissed him right there in the wreckage-strewn courtyard in front of Gruv and the healers and half the surviving garrison. And this time nobody in Kelmouth Hold looked away in disgust or muttered about broken custom. Some of them, Alec noticed, even smiled. They lit the hearth flame together in the small, hidden courtyard behind the customs house, the same forgotten space between warehouse walls where they had first kissed 5 days before, now swept clear of debris by garrison soldiers who had, without being asked, decided the champion and her traitor deserved at least that much privacy for their vigil. Valda struck the spark herself, feeding the small brazier with dry kindling she had kept dry through the entire siege in an oiled pouch at her belt, because some quiet, hopeful part of her, she admitted, had been carrying it since the night he first told her he loved her. They sat together through the last hours of that long night, wrapped in a single heavy fur cloak against the cold, taking turns feeding the small flame when the wind gusted hard enough through the gap in the walls to threaten it, saying little, needing to say little, exhaustion and relief, and something deeper than either settling over them, both like warmth finally returning to frozen hands. Somewhere beyond the courtyard walls, the fortress stirred with the slow business of recovery, hammers already rebuilding, voices already accounting for losses and blessings both. But here, in this small stone space, there was only the two of them and the fire between them, refusing, stubbornly, to go out. "I used to think," Alex said quietly, somewhere in the deep hours before true dawn, watching the small flame gutter and steady again beneath Valda's careful, cupped hands, "that I would spend my whole life crossing that mountain alone, that it was simply the shape my life had taken, and there was no use wishing it otherwise. And now I think I was just waiting for the right storm to get lost in." Valda leaned her head against his shoulder, the firelight catching gold in her amber eyes, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying that the flame itself was not already saying for them. Dawn came slowly over the Ashfang peaks, pale and clean, gilding the frost on the courtyard walls and the smoke still rising thin from the ruined docks below. When the first true light broke over the fjord, the small hearth flame in the hidden courtyard was still burning, steady and low and utterly unbroken, and Valda Thunderroar and Alec Wyatt sat wrapped together beside it, hands linked, foreheads touching, the only two souls in all of Kelmouth Hold who had spent that longest and hardest of nights not fighting to survive it, but simply refusing together to let their fire go out. The fortress around them slowly woke to the business of rebuilding, warehouses to raise again, a harbor chain to mend, a trial to hold for the traders whose greed had nearly cost them everything. But none of it could touch the small, fierce peace that had settled over the two of them in that sheltered corner of stone. Valda lifted her head at last, brushing a thumb along his jaw where soot still clung, and smiled the way Alec had come to understand. She smiled only for him, unguarded and entirely without armor. "Whatever comes next," she said, "the rebuilding, the trials, the grumbling of old fools on both sides who still cannot believe a champion would choose a salt trader over a warrior of her own blood, I would face all of it 100 times over, so long as I face it beside you." "You already have me," Alex said. "You won that fight in the yard 5 days ago, whether you meant to lose it or not." "I meant to lose it," she said, low and certain. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He kissed her then, slow and warm in the pale morning light, and around them the flame they had tended through the whole terrible, glorious night burned on, steady as a promise kept, while the fortress of Kelmouth Hold began, piece by piece, to rebuild itself into something a little stronger, a little kinder, and a little more willing than it had been the day before to believe that a champion and a traitor, an orc and a human, could build something between them that no old law and no ancient prejudice could ever burn down.